This video is the first video for the evolution section of the biology syllabus. I'm going to be breaking the evolution videos into a few smaller videos, so as I did with most of the other sections. I'm going to try and keep the videos short, probably. I'm not sure how long they'll be. We'll see with this first one. This is a little bit of a longer video than some of the others might be, but I'll see how it goes. So we're going to start talking about evolution. We're going to start with diversity, change, and continuity. We're going to look at the origins of the ideas about origins, about how we as humans started as animals, as Earth, as this diversity on Earth. Where did it all come from? So is evolution a hypothesis or a theory? Well, we've got to examine the words hypothesis and theory. A hypothesis is an informed or educated assumption which provides a proposed solution to a problem or an explanation of a scientific phenomenon based on scientific evidence and observations. So in physics, if you do physics, they'll often call your hypothesis, you'll write a hypothesis at the beginning of an experiment, and it's even in bio, sometimes in the bioprax, when you do your hypothesis, it's a lot more guesswork than what we're talking about here with a hypothesis. Here, a hypothesis is not just, oh, I think that the water might boil at 100 degrees Celsius. It's a informed assumption, which is based on evidence and observation. So you've done tests, or someone's done tests or done observations, and only then have they made some sort of assumption that tries to explain a phenomenon or provide a solution to a problem. A hypothesis is tested in a series of experiments or through repeated observation. A hypothesis has to be testable and it has to be falsifiable, which means that there has to be a way to prove this hypothesis wrong. If there's no way of proving it wrong, then how can we know for sure that it's right? This would be something like, do your star signs predict your future? It's kind of, obviously we know it's a bit of a wishy-washy example, but if you said to me, I promise you I am a Leo, and the star sign is telling me that tomorrow I'm going to be really happy, you're going to go into tomorrow finding a way to be happy, because you know in the back of your mind that it's telling you you're supposed to be happy. That's kind of less easily falsified, and it's less scientific almost, whereas something that's falsifiable needs to there's a way to prove it and there's a way to not prove it. So can birds fly? Well, yes, they can. If we see that no birds are ever flying, then we can see that, well, it's falsifiable. It's obviously, this hypothesis can be wrong. That's all they're saying about a hypothesis. When a hypothesis has been tested over and over again, and a lot of people support it, there's a lot of evidence supporting it, and it clearly makes sense, the hypothesis can become a theory. So a theory is an even more substantiated explanation than a hypothesis is. A theory is based on scientific evidence and is usually tested and confirmed by independent groups of researchers. So researchers that don't even know the work of everyone else, and they all come to the same conclusion, then we can see, well, it looks like a pretty good theory. Theories are not static. They can develop and change and be replaced as new evidence is discovered. We consider the theory of evolution to be a theory, a scientific theory, because it's based on a series of hypotheses that have been tested and verified over time. So what is evolution? In general, evolution is change over time. It can be changes in chemicals, matter, solar system, language, and so on. It's the process by which the characteristics of a population, so a group of organisms of similar characteristics living in the same area and able to crossbreed, that's the process by which the characteristics of a population change over time. We're going to look obviously more closely at biological evolution. Biological evolution is genetic changes in a population of living organisms that are inherited over successive generations due to natural selection, resulting in the formation of a new species. So to break it up, biological evolution is changes that occur in the genes and the DNA of organisms, usually due to mutations and interbreeding, meiosis, that sort of thing, primarily mutations. They occur within a population, so organisms of the same species living in the same area. These genetic changes are inherited over generations because of natural selection, which we'll look at a bit later, and they cause the formation of a new species. There's two types of evolution. Macroevolution is the development of new life forms of new species from earlier life forms over many, many generations. It takes a long time. Macroevolution mostly relates to speciation, which is where new species develop from existing species over time. Microevolution is evolution on a smaller scale. It's just variation within a species. Small changes originate in the gene pool, resulting in small changes in the genotype of one species, which is these changes are then passed on to the offspring. So microevolution, a lot of small changes will eventually result in macroevolution. So as we look over a lot longer time period, then in microevolution we'll see a noticeable amount of changes and possibly something causing a new species. The origin and development of life on Earth have been a great source of speculation and conflict from the earliest times, but many scientists support the theory that life on Earth arose from one common ancestor 4.6 billion years ago. It's commonly accepted that the process of evolution occurred where one kind of organism changed into another, and evolutionists believe that this process led to the enormous biodiversity that we currently can see on Earth. It's important to know that evolution is change over time. It doesn't explain the origin of life. It doesn't explain where that first life come from. It explains how we have this biodiversity now. So there's a whole lot of different ways that there's evidence for evolution. Some of the main ones are fossil records, modification by descent, biogeography, genetics, and some other evidence formed. So firstly, looking at fossil records. A fossil is just an organism or the remains of an organism, imprints or footprints of an organism, usually that are preserved in rock. Things like this remains of a woolly mammoth, the imprint of a fern, the footprint of a dinosaur. Fossil records provide evidence of the history of extinct organisms on Earth. Important word being extinct here. The coelacanth is the only exception to this rule. We call the coelacanth a living fossil because we have fossils from millions and millions of years ago, but there are still living ones right now. The coelacanth is a type of fish or aquatic creature. It's actually found, I think it's been found off the coast of South Africa. Fossil records show the climate and the environmental conditions many millions of years ago. A fossil record is the accumulation of all listed and known fossils of different ages that have been discovered by paleontologists worldwide. Paleontologists are people who study fossils. It's important to know that fossil records obviously show only the organisms that were fossilized. They are incomplete, and they're not an indication of all the organisms existing at a particular time because, firstly, only very few individuals actually fossilize. If they're soft bodies and they decompose after death, then they won't be fossilized, their structures won't be preserved. And fossilization also needs very specific conditions to occur. Burial needs to happen rapidly, there needs to be high pressure, low oxygen. If these conditions aren't available, fossilization won't occur. If we look at rocks over time, the earlier, simpler fossils are in the deeper, older rock layers. Obviously, the deeper they are, the older the rock layers are because the soil piles up. And we find that there are more complex fossils in the more recent rock layers. This shows that evolution has occurred in this order, and we've started out simple and we've become more complex, more a large range of organisms. The age of the fossils can be determined from the age of the rock in which they occur. So we can usually find a way to date the rock, and by knowing that, okay, the fossil was found in this rock, the rock is this old, the fossil must be round about this old as well. Fossil records contribute to the compilation of geological timescale from the origin of the Earth until the present. So they let us know that, okay, well, dinosaurs were present round about this time. We saw the first terrestrial animals around about this time. That's the sort of thing we can see through fossils. The geological time scale clearly shows the increase in complexity over time. Organisms have become more complex and less simple. We can see here there's some old prokaryotic fossils that we can see just looking at them how simple they are, mostly single-celled. Whereas here we have these complex, diverse, multicellular organisms. Then the second piece of evidence for evolution is modification by descent. We know that the basic body plans of different plants and animal groups are modified to adapt to their different environments. So this involves natural selection, and it shows that that organisms have adapted to survive in specific climate, weather, environmental conditions. We call this modification by descent. So one of the examples of this is the pentadactyl limb. The forelimbs, sometimes the hind limbs as well, but mostly forelimbs, are various vertebrates like amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. They look different and they perform very different functions, but they show the same basic body plan. We have one proximal long bone, which we call the humerus, two distal bones, the radius and ulna, a whole lot of wrist bones, the carpals, 5 metacarpals forming the palm, and then phalanges, or fingers. Some of the functions, as I said, they have different functions, would be digging, flying, running, swimming, climbing, etc. So we can see here that a human, a horse, whale, turtle, frog, and bird obviously are completely different vertebrates. They don't look similar at all. But if you look at the pentadactyl limb, at the forelimb structure of each of them, you can see the structure is actually very similar, with one long bone, some distal bones, a whole lot of wrist bones, 5 metacarpals, and phalanges. And you can have a look at these pictures and see that they're actually very similar. What we call this is homologous structures. So they're similar structures, such as this pentadactyl limb, these forelimbs, and they have the same body plan, but they perform different functions. These are homologous structures. This is really important to know the difference between homologous structures and analogous structures. Pronunciation, it's not really important, obviously. So homologous structures are structures or body parts that have a similar structure but different functions. So like a human, cat, whale, and bat, we can see they have a very similar structure, but obviously they have very different functions. Humans use their arms for carrying and movement and eating and that sort of thing. Cats for walking, whales for swimming, bats for flying, and so on. So organisms that have a common structure share a common ancestor. Sorry, that word's missing there. So homologous structures show evidence of a common ancestor. They all evolved from one ancestor that had this pentadactyl limb structure. If we then look at analogous structure, these are body parts of the organisms that have the same function but different structure. So if we look at bird's wing versus an insect's wing, we can see that the bird wing has this pentadactyl limb, but the insect wing is obviously a completely different structure, but they both have the same function of flight. This picture can be a little bit misleading because a bat wing and a bird wing actually do have the same structure, so they are homologous structures. But the important part to note here is bird versus insect or bat versus insect. Those are analogous structures. Homologous structures provide evidence of evolution because the similarities, as I said, can be traced back to a common ancestor. So this would be the common ancestor where you can see it has this one structure, and now these animals have all evolved from it, all with similar structures and very different functions. The changes or adaptations in the structure of the forelimb develop independently in each group according to the organism's habitat and their mode of life. So for example, if they're living in the air, the water, the trees, on the ground, that's how they develop slightly different structures, still similar but just slightly different, and different functions. So there can also be modification within a species. Many species have changed over millions of years to form the species we know today. And these modern species are modified descendants of earlier species. These adaptations obviously occurred, allowing them to adapt to different environments. And one of the examples is the evolution of a horse, where you can see here, this is what a horse looks like, which is quite different to what horses look like today. We can see that they're probably the same, they're very similar organisms, but they wouldn't be exactly the same species. The third piece of evidence for evolution is biogeography. This is the study of the distribution of existing and extinct plant and animal species in specific geographic regions. When a species is existing, we say it's extant. These studies prove that closely related species usually occur in the same geographical region, and this could suggest that they share a common ancestor. Biogeographical regions can also be isolated from each other by barriers, things like mountains, oceans, etc., which prevent species spreading from one region to another. This can lead to the formation of new species because as they're separated, each population group will evolve separately. And as I said, some of these barriers will be mountain ranges, oceans, small land masses, and deserts. The plant and animal life in different geographical regions, but with similar habitats and climatic conditions, but separated by a geographical barrier, may also differ drastically. So, for example, the North and the South Pole are obviously very separate from each other. The species can't crossbreed between the North and the South Pole, but they're very similar environments. However, we can see that the species there actually differ drastically. In the North Pole, we have polar bears, and in the South Pole, we have penguins. Africa and South America have similar climatic conditions, but with different animal species. In Africa, we have elephants, lions, camels, etc. In South America, there are pumas, llamas, and jaguars. Australia also has more or less the same latitude as Africa and South America. They have things like kangaroos, wallabies, and koala bears. This shows that these plant and animal species occurring in different geographical regions don't share a common ancestor because they're so different. However, there are some examples of animals that do share common ancestors across the land masses, or they share similar features, which suggests that they could have a common ancestor that developed before the land masses split up. So this would be something like flightless birds. In Africa, we have the ostrich. In Mauritius and Madagascar, there's the elephant birds, which are now extinct. In Australia, we have the emu. In New Zealand, we have kiwis and the extinct moas. South America, we have the Tina mouse and the rheas. And in these islands here, we have the cassowaries. We can see that these places occur at quite similar latitudes. So the environmental conditions could be quite similar. And although all these birds live in different land masses and obviously live in separate species, scientists have to suggest that they actually do have a common ancestor because they all have quite similar features, one of the important ones being they can't fly. So it suggested that there was one common ancestor, and then the land masses split apart. So these birds were all, these one common ancestors were split into separate populations based on the land mass they were on. So they were separate from the other populations, now separated by this barrier of water. And because they were in different populations and they had slightly different climatic conditions and different environmental conditions, they developed different adaptations to living in their environments. And over time, they became completely new species. This occurred because of mutations and different natural selections. This explanation coincides with Darwin's theory of evolution, which we'll get to, where individuals are the same species living in different habitats, so they're geographically separated. They adapt to their changed environmental conditions, undergo different mutations, and may develop into different new species over time. Genetics is also provides some of the strongest evidence of evolution. Genetics is the study of inheritance. By sequencing genes on DNA, we're able to map the relationships between different species. If species have quite similar DNA, similar sequences, etc., then we know that they're quite closely related. Species that as I said, have similar sequences of genes of their DNA or on their RNA are closely related. If they have very different sequences, they'll be distantly related. This is called a phylogenetic or an evolutionary tree, which maps the evolutionary relationships. As the branches split, this shows a common ancestor. So all these species here, and lorises, potos, and lemurs all share one ancestral primate. Then over here, tarsiers and these species here share this common ancestor. We can see here that the most closely related organisms on this map are chimpanzees and humans. We have this common ancestor here, and we can see that around about this time, which looks about 6 million years ago, that's when we split, chimpanzees and humans split from their common ancestor. Before that time, there was only species that were the same. There wasn't separate species of chimpanzees and humans. And we can see that because we have similar DNA, scientists can see that. They can map, they know how often mutations usually occur. And by seeing that, okay, well, we have, for example, 3% difference in our DNA between chimps and humans, we know that that would be around about, 2 million nucleotide differences, which means around about 2 million mutations. Mutations occur this often. Therefore, overall, if there's 2 million nucleotide differences, it must have overall taken 6 million years for the two species to have separated. And that's how we can see that this is when the chimps and humans split. That's one of the ways using genetics to look at the relationships. So we looked at here a phylogenetic tree. We can also use a cladogram to look at relationships between organisms. This is now relationships among species based on a shared genetic characteristic. For phylogenetic tree, we were based on a common ancestor. Now we're based on genetic characteristics. And as the organisms split from the cladogram, it shows that they share or they don't share a genetic characteristic. So here we can see that primates and rodents and crocodiles and birds all share the same characteristics of having vertebrae, a bony skeleton, 4 limbs, and an amniotic egg. But primates and rodents have hair, which is a shared characteristic, but they don't share this characteristic with crocs and birds, which do share the characteristic of eggs with shells. Something like sharks, the only characteristic they share with these organisms here is being vertebrates. Sharks don't have a bony skeleton or 4 limbs or amniotic eggs, hair, or eggs with shells. So they are a separate branch of the cladogram. Obviously, something like eggs with shells, sharks may have. I have no idea if sharks have eggs with shells. I'd assume they do. But they can't include this characteristic on their cladogram because they don't have these primary characteristics before that. So cladograms, basically the important part to know about this is that they relate to genetic characteristics as opposed to common ancestors. And then the last piece of evidence for evolution is embryology. Embryology just shows that embryos of different animals go through similar stages during development. So a fish, a rabbit, and a man all have very similar looking embryos right at the beginning. And over time, they develop into very different looking embryos in the end of time. But because they have, the embryos look quite similar at the beginning, scientists suggest that this could be evidence for evolution as well, for having one common ancestor that may have started out with an embryo similar looking to this. So I'm going to end the video there. We're going to have quite a few more videos for evolution, but this is the start of the section. Let me know if you have any questions.